Thank you very much. Well, my two gracious colleagues have left me a fair amount of time. Let me just, by way of thanks for Imam Khalid Grieg's wonderful talk, I want to add a couple of brief anecdotes about Columbus that he was too modest to include, I suspect. Some of you may know this, but Columbus was actually aided greatly. I'm sorry, can you hear me in the back? Sorry, I tend to speak rather quietly. Also, I'm a college professor. My father's a college professor. My sister's a college professor. And so I'm going to probably want to take questions, but I also invite those of you standing if you'd like. There are plenty of seats. It'll be much more comfortable. I'm going to speak about a complex topic, so I think it's best to sit down. In any case, returning to Columbus, he was very reliant on cutting-edge works of navigation by Arab and Muslim scholars. So and the other point that's interesting is that all indications are that the navigator on Columbus's expedition was in fact a Muslim. And the Spanish, and particularly the Italians, knew very well that when it came to navigation, trigonometry and the various mathematical sciences needed for navigation, that there really was no better assistant than a Muslim. So he was very much accompanied by Muslims. He knew that, he knew his debt. The second point I want to add to Imam Khalid Grieg's talk is some leftover rituals. In South Carolina, for example, there are anthropological records to this day of very isolated communities of African Americans who are Christian, but at Easter they circumnavigate the church. Well, what does that remind you of? Well, of course it reminds us of the Hajj ritual. None of them seem to know why they do this, but they've always done this. They also make cookies in the shape of a crescent for Easter. So these little rituals hang on as artifacts, and I think what's useful and what I try to do in my own work is identify these little artifacts and then connect them to a larger theory of how important Islam is for Western culture. And that's what I'm going to speak to you about today. So I want to discuss what I consider an often overlooked aspect of relations between Islam and the West, and that is what I would describe as the broad historical, intellectual, and philosophical structures that dictate the way the West apprehends the world of the Muslims and of Islam. Because for any change in East-West relationship to really be fundamental, we have to take a look at the core. Now, of course, this is an enormous enterprise, and I, in fact, earned my doctorate in sociology for a very in-depth and theoretical examination of this, the result of which was my most recent book, Islam Through Western Eyes, From the Crusades to the War on Terrorism. And in fact, at 3 p.m., I'll be part of a conference with Imam Khalid Grieg and other honorable speakers. I hope you'll come. We're going to talk about justice and injustice. And I'm going to speak about the roots of injustice, that is, why and how it is the West tends to look at the Muslim world. And I hope give you a roadmap to kind of understand where these attitudes come from. But for now, in my limited time, though I have a fear I'm going to go over, I'm going to talk about Islamic science and philosophy. And because I'm addressing a predominantly Muslim audience, which is a real treat for me because I don't get to do that as often as I would like, I also want to note that when I use words like Arab science, Muslim science, I am not referring to a narrow sense of Arab identity. I am referring to scholars from as far east as China and India to Spain, but who wrote in the idiom of Arabic. Sometimes when I give my talk, particularly Persian audiences get very upset. Oh, you only talk about Arabs. Well, I don't mean Arabs with a small a, as it were. I mean the Arabic cultural milieu. So let's turn to the House of Wisdom, which was, in fact, the subject, and this is not show and tell, but of an earlier book I wrote called The House of Wisdom, How the Arabs Transformed Western Civilization. That came out in 2009, has been translated into 11 foreign languages, and hopefully will continue to be read widely. So let's look at the House of Wisdom. And in particular, let's look at the vital contributions that Islamic science and philosophy has made to the very idea of Western culture. I also want to touch, if I have time, on some remarkable stories of at least one wandering European scholar who set off to bring science, philosophy, and technology from the Muslim world back to the medieval Christian lands. Now, like most narratives of distant events, I believe this contains important lessons for today, particularly at this time of acute tension between the Islamic world and the Western world. And I'll return to this theme at the conclusion of my remarks, and I hope we'll have time for questions, but I guess we'll have to see. So let's jump right in. My starting point is 1096. This is the year of the First Crusade. The Crusaders are preparing to invade the Holy Lands, which were then under the control of the Muslims. Now, this was Christian holy war on a previously unimagined scale. Yet, the strictly military consequences of the Crusades, I would argue, were minimal. They make good copy, they make colorful movies, but they really weren't that important. What was really important was that the Crusades gave Western Europe, or what we would today call Western Europe, the first look at the Muslim world as a vast cultural, intellectual, and economic superpower, which it very much was. Now, as you can imagine, many of the Crusader armies, and I'm talking about the rank and file, they were peasants, they were soldiers, they were artisans, and if you believe contemporary accounts, there were thieves, murderers, and adulterers as well. They wouldn't really have taken much notice of the cultural riches of the Muslim lands. But Europe's small, educated elite certainly did notice, and it became something, this came as something of a shock. So despite public displeasure from the popes in Rome, policies and decrees, the ideas and commerce began to flow between East and West. And the merchants of the Italian city-states, particularly Genoa and Venice, stepped in to capture the trade in oil, perfume, textiles, and precious metals. In other words, there was a lot of money to be made here. Our Western system of Arabic numerals was popularized in large part thanks to their use in commercial contracts. So when an Italian merchant and an Eastern merchant made a deal, they had to use an agreed numerical system. And in fact, the system of double entry bookkeeping, which is very common in the Western world, comes from the Arabic tradition of accounts. Even the language that the West adopted was largely drawn from Persian and Arabic sources. So we have words like tariff, check, arsenal, and so on. These became common currency in Western. Now, think about what a word means. We don't often think about. If we don't have a concept, we don't need a word for it. So it was not just the introduction of the word, but the important thing is the introduction of the concept that we need tariffs. We need to have checks or ways of transmitting money without using cash. We have to have double entry bookkeeping. Maps, nautical charts, and navigational instruments, as I mentioned, these were all areas where the Muslims excelled, were now increasingly important to Western economies. And most interesting of all, particularly to me as a writer, Arabic books became a much sought-after commodity. Now, this was a time when the best and richest monasteries in the Western Europe might have perhaps 2 or 3 dozen volumes. Well, the great Muslim cities housed hundreds of thousands of books, many concerning medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and alchemy. In fact, there's a story that when the Sultan wanted to donate books in order to create a new religious school, he told them to take 80,000 volumes. Apparently, nobody even noticed that they were missing. So what was the source of this incredible accumulation of learning on the part of the Muslims? To explore that, we have to turn to the Near East and the founding in the 8th century of the new imperial capital by the ruler of the Abbasid Empire. We heard a little bit about the Abbasids a few minutes ago, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. Now, his new city was created in a circular design. Al-Mansur was a student of Euclidean geometry, and it very much appealed to him to have his throne, his stronghold, at the very geometric center of this enormous empire that he was and his armies were constructing. So this circular design placed him symbolically and mathematically at the very center of this empire. And the name of the city, which was displayed on coins and other official uses, was Medinat al-Salam, the city of peace. But none of the locals called it that. Does anyone know what it was? Baghdad. Very good. An old Persian name. In fact, that whole area was heavily Persian. And the shift from Damascus to Baghdad, so the shift eastward of the locus of Islamic world power, which took place, was a ratification of this gradual shift since the death of the Prophet in 632. Now, Baghdad was to be a recognizably modern city. Well, what do I mean by that? Let's think about what a city is. A city, and the Muslims, the historic medieval Muslims were great city builders. They built the biggest cities, the most efficient cities, dwarfing anything in Europe at the time. So what is a city? To me, a city is a place where people of different backgrounds, different economic stations, and generally different ethnic origins, and perhaps and often different religious beliefs, can all live together. Now, how do they live together? Well, this means you jettison or give up the clan structures that characterized Arab tribal life. If I go into well, this morning I bought a coffee at Seattle's Best. I gave the woman $5. She gave me back $3 and a cup of coffee. Now, I knew when I gave her the money that she was going to give me the money, the change, and the coffee. Why? Well, we have a system of not just of culture, but of laws. If she didn't give me the money, ultimately I would say I could complain to the police, for example. So what does that tell me? That tells me that I don't have to know her or be related to her in order to have an exchange. Whereas in traditional Arab society, you had clan leaders. If you and I made a deal, I'm going to buy the sheep for so many pieces of silver, and you don't hand over the sheep after I've given you the money, I go to the clan leader and I say, hey, this guy ripped me off. And they work it out. That's no longer possible or necessary or desirable in a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, highly sophisticated city. And Baghdad was all of that. This eastward movement of power also was a recognition on the part of the Abbasid Empire of the very important role now being played by Persians. And the Persians were converting from Christianity. There were Jewish communities in Persia, and of course, the Zoroastrian tradition. Now, Al-Mansur, the caliph, he cultivated the sciences, and he ordered up translations into Arabic of numerous works of Hindu, Greek, and Persian scholars. To support this, he established a royal library, which he modeled after these historic libraries of the great Persian kings. And this was, in fact, the origin of what we call the House of Wisdom, or in Arabic, the Beit al-Hikmah. And it was an institutional expression of a state intellectual policy. Large sums of money were dedicated to the scholars of the House of Wisdom, and Abbasid society enthusiastically supported the effort. If you wanted to get ahead in Abbasid society and you weren't a great scholar, or you weren't even that smart, but you had money, you could hire a scholar to translate a great important work of Hindu philosophy, of Hindu mathematics, more likely of Greek philosophy or Greek science, and this would redound to your benefit and help you advance within the society. So it was not just the caliphs, it was across the elites and into the middle classes of Abbasid society, took on great importance, the notion of learning and scholarship. It's also important that these translations were not an end of themselves, but were a first step. And this, I hope to get to at the end of my talk, is a source of much misunderstanding within Western scholarship and Western popular debate. The Arabs, the Muslims, were not just caretakers. They got involved with the text. Think about translation. I know Russian quite well, but I could not translate a Russian work of physics because I don't know much about physics. So here you have Arab scholars, they're getting this Hindu mathematics, this Greek mathematics. The notion that they had no understanding of mathematics but somehow magically created these wonderful translations is, on the face of it, absurd. And yet that is the notion within Western scholarship, that they translated it but did not contribute. In fact, as I document in the House of Wisdom with some examples of experiments, they not only translated, but they tested and retested and refined the findings and the experiments of earlier scholars. So what we call a translation from the Greek to the Arabic was very often, and in most important cases, a vast improvement. So the output, the Arabic version of some of the great Greek cosmology was far superior to the original Greek. And ironically, in a later period, in the so-called Renaissance, there was a movement in Italy and France to go back to the original Greek text. And so they threw out the Arabic translations, which had been retranslated back into Latin, and said, no, we want to read the original. What they didn't realize is that they were costing themselves hundreds of years of scholarly advances made by Muslim scholars. Now, of course, it's worth noting that there were tensions within the Arab and Muslim community about the role of science and the role of religion, but there was no real conflict. This is another Western notion that has been imposed and implanted on top of scholarship. In the Western experience, as you know, there was a lot of tension between science and religion. But the Muslim community never really suffered this because science came out of the same intellectual tradition as other aspects of religious scholarship. There was not this wall between them. So let me give you just one quick example. As you know, all Muslims are required to know the direction of Mecca, to pray, to align the bodies of the dead, to sacrifice animals, etc. The earliest Muslims of Central Asia and Spain simply directed their prayers to the south, which was an imitation of Muhammad's behavior when he moved to Medina. But as the Arabs' understanding of the world, of the universe, became more and more sophisticated, they began to demand greater accuracy in informing their practices, their ritual practices, to sacred geography. So the question was, well, where exactly is Mecca? Now don't forget, you have an early Islamic community, it's very small. It's in the Arab Peninsula. Everybody knows where Mecca is, just the way everyone in Hartford knows where New York is. When you start having Muslim communities in China and in Spain, how would you know where Mecca is? There would be an old Hajj road that you might use, or there was tradition, but you really didn't know where it was. And so as mathematical science got more sophisticated, the Arab religious and Muslim religious leaders began to consult scholars. Well, where is Mecca? What is particularly noteworthy here is that religious opinion deferred. It gave sanction to the scientific and mathematical arguments. And these scholars argued that, or pointed out, that the common sense direction, well, Mecca's over that way somewhere because that's south, or that's west, was not the actual Qibla, that the Qibla was a mathematically determined point that required knowledge of trigonometry and other aspects of spherical geometry. So very complicated, very sophisticated questions. So let me give you an example. You all went to school and you saw on the wall those big maps that show that Africa is really small, the United States is really big. And why is that? Because that's what's called a Mercator map. That is a flattening out of a round space. So you can use those maps. I just flew in from Portland, Oregon. I didn't drive, but I could have driven from Portland to Hartford with one of those flat maps and I would be here. But I would not have taken the mathematically shortest route, which is a curve. Just like an airplane, when I fly from Portland to Australia, which I unfortunately do sometimes, we go over towards some of the polar caps. That's the shortest way, it saves fuel. Islamic tradition very early on accepted that the shortest direction was actually the Qibla. So even though on a paper map, New York might be this way, the scholar would say, no, if you go this way, you'll be there more quickly. That requires an extremely sophisticated knowledge of mathematics. So in fact, the trigonometric functions that we suffered through, or I know I suffered through in junior high school, sine, cosine, secant, cosecant, tangent, cotangent, the Arabs invented 5 of those. The first came from the Hindu. Are we running out of time already? Okay, I have 5 minutes. I also have a pocket watch. It says I have extra time. I will go as quickly as I can. What I want to emphasize is that religion was not the enemy of scientific knowledge in the Muslim tradition. The Quran and its emphasis on good health was an impulse to physicians to learn to heal the sick. At the same time, in medieval Christian tradition, the sick indicated something evil, something that could be exorcised. And so we have these very graphic accounts of Crusader medicine where Christians would say, okay, well, we have to cut the leg off because it's infected, and the Muslim doctor would come along and say, no, we can treat that infection in a different way. So what's important is not to get persuaded, as it were, by a traditional history of science that says, no, Islam is somehow opposed to science, is somehow opposed to development. Now, if you notice the cover of my book, it has a device here. I don't know if anyone knows what this is. I'll save you a lot of time and tell you that it's called an astrolabe. And the astrolabe was the most powerful analog computing device of its day. You could tell the height of a well, the depth of a well, the height of a mountain. You could tell the time, and you could tell where you were on the face of the earth. And I have adopted the astrolabe as the cover of my book, and it's on my business card, and it's sort of a metaphor, I think, for Arab science. It drew from a Greek tradition. The astrolabe was originally developed by Greek science, but the Muslim scholars improved it and then passed it along to Western culture. So I'm unfortunately going to have to skip through. I should say that a lot of my story is not only devoted to the riches of Arab science, and I hope that some of you will take a look at the book, but also to the ways in which this was transmitted westward. There were some very remarkable Western scholars who followed the Crusade. They did not go to kill Muslims, but to learn from them. They learned Arabic. They brought back texts and really planted the seeds of a scientific revolution that we take for granted as Western, really has many of its origins in the work done by Muslim and Arab scholars. So I've been able to go into a little bit of detail. What I've tried to do is give you a taste of my own research and how I try to establish the Muslims' rightful place in the history of Western ideas. And I hope that I can help transform ideas about how it is that Islam and the West interact. And I'm going to skip ahead to the very end and say that as much as it's been a pleasure to give you this overview, I want to focus on one last idea with your permission. And that is, East-West relations are, unfortunately, East-West meaning Western relations with Muslim communities are unfortunately not at a good place right now. We all know that. But I want to propose a solution, which is something most scholars tend not to do. I want to suggest that we set aside this notion of a clash of civilizations and accept the historical record, which has convinced me, and I hope will convince all of you, that Islam is a Western, that the West and Islam are not engaged in an intercultural conflict, but really represent more of an intra-cultural rivalry, like my rivalry with my older sister, who's also a college professor. Now, if we do that, we don't set up a barrier, but we say, wait a minute, there's a continuum that can be easily identified in science, in philosophy. We would not have Thomas Aquinas if we didn't have the Arabs. We would not have astronomy if we didn't have Arab science. We look at our Western scientific lexicon, azimuth, zenith, algebra, and zero. These are all Arabic technical terms. The Latin preference I told you about for astronomical texts turned out to be a disaster, and so they went back to the Arabic translations. The unmistakable strains of the Arab philosophers Avicenna and Averroes throughout the work of Thomas Aquinas and other seminal Western thinkers. The unsuccessful banning of Arab teaching at the University of Paris. They tried to banish Arab philosophy from the University of Paris in the 13th century. It didn't work. The Pope would announce, you'll be excommunicated. The professors said, no, we need to study this stuff. And the everyday presence at our dinner table of Arab origin crops, such as artichokes, apricots, hard wheat, watermelon, and spinach. I believe when we open our mind, all this takes a new meaning, and it sheds a new light on the problem of East and West. We shift the emphasis from the traditional view, as I said, of intercultural rivalry to one of intracultural contest. Rather than delimit what is really a porous and changing boundary between East and West, it might be possible to assign both the realms, both Islam and the West, to one single, what I call an interactive space. In effect, this would mark a return to the views of the world that was captured in one of the great documents of the history of ideas, and that is the World Atlas created by the Muslim scholar al-Idrisi in the 12th century, by commission of a Christian king of Sicily, which at the time was what we would now call multi-faith. It was Muslim, Catholic, Jewish, and Eastern Orthodox. So I thank you very much. I hope we have time for questions. I also want to say that I will be speaking at 3 p.m. in a more theoretical talk with Imam Khalid Griggs and other speakers at the main hall. And afterwards, I have some business cards that lead to my website if you're interested in my other books and my other work. And thank you very much.